Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're in the midst of our book by Craig Keener on miracles. And Keener is taking Hume to task, especially when it comes to his circularity in allowing for different types of evidences for miracles. And this one being the focus on not just the logical circularity, but also undercutting witness testimony that we covered last time. And so, of course, you can always find all those previous episodes on your favorite podcast area, whether you're listening to us or watching us. You just happen to go to whatever playlist it is a part of, or caveofthecross.com, and you can check them all out there in really easy to watch and consume format. And so we're going to continue on with part 2 of chapter 5 here, Are Miracles Possible? And we're going to kind of look more at what Hume does to witnesses, witness testimony, as it concerns miracles here. All right, so while claiming logic, Hume's approach to testimony contravenes the form of logic normally applied to the value of witnesses. It seems like if you have a witness to something, boy, that's a good thing. Even a single witness to an event is always evidence for something. You can usually have a good questioner question this alleged witness to see if they're truthful or if all their faculties are working. If the very least, you can kind of put a reference point to time or a circumstance or even the weather. You can usually pull something from a witness claiming to be there, even if the person is found to be lying. You can talk about that as part of evidence. But this is even a slight movement of the needle towards any event. If you have even the slight hope of having someone who's a witness to it. For me, Hume, that might be a little problematic for you to have even one witness or any witness or the entire world witnesses. So we'll see what he does here. So just as one may appeal to the regularity of nature, revising our understanding of that regularity periodically to accommodate new discoveries, one may appeal to regularities involved in how we otherwise evaluate legal testimony or historical evidence. Hume's arguments against miracles privileges the regularity of nature against the regularity of human evidence, while presupposing it against allowing divine causation. So, just things are happening in the normal way. We all know it. Rocks fall down, rockets go up and they stay up until they run out of rocket fuel. And so if you run into something that traps the rocket out in outer space, well, we know that's not possible. It didn't happen because that's not the normal course of events. And so we know that there's not a force field around our planet that causing the rocket to be stuck in the middle of space. If a rock falls down and happens to not hit the ground, well, we know that's not possible, even if we're all witnessing it, because the normal course of events, the regularity of nature says it can't happen. Then when things do happen, well, how did we get from understanding things like, the intricate circles of the universe to now having a better understanding of how the planets move, the wanderers themselves, without having direct human evidence to upend this normal cause of human nature? Well, that's kind of a problem for Hume here.
Yeah. And so you notice, again, what Hume is doing with regard to this is saying that our experience shows that miracles don't happen because we've never experienced them. The only thing that we have is testimonies about miracles. Well, if you weigh testimony versus our experience, testimony loses, right? So that's what he's trying to get at here. Right? And so therefore, it's a kind of epistemological argument. Although, since it's a deductive argument, he has problems, and that's what Keener is pointing out. Now, Keener tells us that perhaps the sphere that weighs testimony most deliberately is that of the courts, right? And so because of the stakes involved, legal approaches to testimony tend to reflect vigorous discipline and are applicable to the matters that we're talking about here. Excuse me. And thus, he tells us that some statisticians cite against Hume the work of the mathematician Charles Babbage, right? He was in late 1700s, 1800s. Now, he's the originator, Keener tells us, of the modern computer, right? And so regarding witnesses, this is what Babbage has to say. Where a significant number of witnesses agree without prior collusion, an event's probability increases sufficiently to overturn any biases against it. right? So if you have a number of witnesses, so several witnesses, so that's one, component, I guess we might say,
Mhm.
in the calculation. So you have a number of witnesses, right? A significant number is what he says, and they all agree on a particular happening of an event, and there was no collusion before you talked with them, then he suggests that an event's probability increases sufficiently to overturn any bias against it, even if I haven't experienced it,
Right.
right? And so there's a criteria that he gives us to evaluate the value of testimony, right? Eyewitness testimony. And so, in fact, Keener tells us that Babbage formulated his mathematical critique directly against Hume, right?
So what you're watching this on is direct evidence of being against Hume. So you're welcome. This is great. Yeah. So think about a bank robbery, right? So you could say maybe that the bank teller who's held up has some bias that would cause her to point the finger only at one person. But if you have a customer in there as well who was in the same building but not directly in the line of fire or at the point of the gun, well, then that adds weight to the teller's testimony. And if they're all agreeing that John Doe is the person who held up the bank, you add the security guard and the delivery driver and all these different people who are a part of it. There's no collusion. It's independent witnesses to themselves and a significant number. And there's no collusion. They're told not to talk to each other. That's a big stickler for courts. In fact, if collusion is found between even the questioner and the witness, it's thrown out as prejudicial. So this is something that we view as some of the highest priority, unless you have, direct computer video evidence pointed directly at it. Some of the best type of evidence that you are going to get is direct eyewitness, people who were there, who were involved, who are able to be questioned from both perspectives and hold up under that criteria is sometimes even more beneficial than just a static video camera. So this is something that Hume almost doesn't allow, and Babbage took advantage of to here. And so you're consuming the technology based on Hume. So I guess we could be grateful for Hume. So it may be a slight miracle in and of himself right there. Well, already in Hume's day, it was clear to some that he failed to take an adequate account for the confluence of multiple independent and reliable witnesses increases the probability of testimony's accuracy. In the case of multiple independent witnesses, one no longer requires extraordinary proof to secure a probability against prior improbabilities. If Hume's challenge against individual testimony was in some respects questionable, he did not even address the force of multiple testimonies, which seriously changes the probability calculus. So
the claim is that Hume didn't even take into consideration, multiple testimonies about a particular thing, right? And he, it's almost as if he dismissed them here, and that's the issue here that he's trying to point out. Right. And of course, Babbage is suggesting that multiple testimonies with regard to an incident adds credibility to the possibility, the probability that the event happened.
Right, which is something. If it's miracles, right? The accounts in both the Old and New Testament, the Bible in totality, you should realize that there is at least some evidence of multiple eyewitnesses. At the very least, the four Gospels themselves are independent in of themselves eyewitnesses. Now, you can definitely critique that. But to say, well, one guy was happening along and he saw the resurrected Jesus and went off on his merry way and didn't interact whatsoever, and that's what all Christianity hangs its hat on. That's never been the case. Paul's challenged to go to all the apostles and to the 500 and to himself last. All these people are claims of independent, multiple eyewitnesses. So this is something that Hume should have taken into account into his argument, but he just doesn't seem to.
Yeah. And so he tells us that for miracles, and he's going to, talk more about this here, this particular issue, it presupposes a standard of proof so high that any evidence is effectively ruled out in advance. So that is, Hume so frames his position that he renders it unfalsifiable, and therefore not tenable for public discourse by traditional standards of logic. And unfortunately, Keener tells us this heads I win, tails you lose form of argument remains popular even today, even with respect for miracles.
Right, exactly. All right. Well, what about rejecting unusual and rare events? Well, Hume cites the uniform experience of modern people. Of course, it's got to be modern people against miracles. So
Yeah, modern people are the Hume and his buddies, I
right,
guess.
right. Which is almost ironic because in today's world, they're seen as very almost Luddites, head stuck in the sand, backwards thinking people that don't have the ability to photocopy their books or even have running toilets. So modern people tend to change with modern advancement, I guess. Well, as Keener has noted, Hume implies that he uses the inductive approach characteristics of empiricism, yet ruling out new evidence on the basis of supposed uniform experience is hardly inductive. Scholars identify various problems with his approach, and far from the spirit we normally associate with intellectual inquiry, a priori rejection of all these claims declare victory by fiat rather than by fair exploration. Again, if you're going to write the rules and you say, bring me a miracle, and you throw out all evidence for miracles, I mean, that's an easy win. So it doesn't seem like we're doing any good with bringing our evidence before Hume. It's almost like you're casting pearls before swine. If I'm probably the first person to coin that term, and so maybe we shouldn't do that. So that's what would come to expect from Hume.
And so Keener tells us that first of all, then, with regard to this, this issue of uniform, and he's going to talk more about this later in the book. He tells us, he says, first, there's no such uniform experience against miracles, whether or not one trusts the claims of tens of millions of people that have experienced miracles, right? So many claims, at least some of them substantive, offer a rather vigorous challenge to simply assuming a uniform experience against miracles. So the first thing that he's suggesting here, or that he's attacking, we might say, is this notion of uniform experience against miracles. There is no such thing as that because we have thousands of claims of miracles. So how can that be uniform experience against miracles, right? And so he tells us that the uniformity argument essentially rejects all miracle reports, which are, inconvenient to the uniformity premise, yet such reports are very widely claimed. So he kind of says, Hume kind of assumes that there's uniform experience, but then that has to force him to dismiss all the, I guess when I say non-uniform claim of the thousands of claims of miracles that people have had, right?
Yeah. And Keener later in this chapter, I think it's the Janissaries, I want to say it's a J word, who have reported miracles. It's almost it's unable to be held by people who are bringing up these claims today because it's problematic for Catholics and Protestants don't want to claim it. But the fact that things happen should be viewed independent on our kind of our denominational beliefs in that respect and figure out if the events actually happened. And so that's something that I think Keener does well, at least a little bit later in this chapter, that he says that he's going to do of making that point as a point of contention for proponents of miracles. Well, again, one cannot simply rule out miracles based on all of human experience, contrary to Hume's suggestion. Well, because humans experience claims many examples of miracles, right? So that humanity never experienced miracles. Well, there seems to be a lot of claims of miracles, and we know this because we talked about it in chapter 4, where we talked about even historians of ancient times claiming to be miracles. Now, you can dismiss them all, right, as not being true, but to say that humans at least don't experience miracles is almost a non-starter because humans have claimed to have experienced miracles. Again, 40 different authors, 66 books, we've documented at least people having claimed experience of miracles. Again, you can throw them all out and say it didn't happen. But
you can't say that uniform experience,
right.
Indicates that miracles don't happen, because you can't say that, right?
Right.
Because there are lots of experiences of miracles.
Right. No humans die because I haven't experienced death. And so if you bring me dead people, then I'm just going to say, well, those weren't ever alive people. And if you show me that they were alive, I say, well, they are alive there. And so you can't show me them being dead. Well, those people aren't people. So therefore, again, we can just make our claims so, preposterous that we're not
can't be
allowing for
falsified.
any evidence to come in and falsify it, right?
Yeah.
Which again, falsifiability, if we want to throw out falsifiability, we can do that, but again, that's almost a non-starter for the other side as well. Well, granted, reports of unusual events must be more carefully examined than reports of ordinary ones, but it is methodologically fallacious to correlate the unusualness of an event with the unreliability of a report concerning it.
So
rockets go up, and so we know the Challenger, in 1986 didn't explode because a good majority of time rockets don't explode. And so we know that it didn't explode because the uniformity of rockets is to go up and come back down. So the Challenger disaster never happened, right? I mean, that's what we're saying here.
Right. So his problem here, his issue is this, the fallacious idea that, well, it's unusual and therefore that means that the report is unreliable.
Right.
And that just doesn't correlate, right? Just because it's unusual doesn't mean the report is unreliable. Mm-hmm. And so, that's his worry here. All right, and he tells us likewise, there's a Life magazine reported an extremely improbable event. Life magazine, go figure. He says this one conceivably in a religious context.
Oh no, even worse.
For those, right? And so he says, and this is for those who regard such context as particularly problematic. So what was the event? Well, on March 1st, 1950, all 15 members of a church choir arrived late for choir rehearsal scheduled for 7:15. They were all late. Right?
All 15 people. Wow.
Yeah. And they all had distinct reasons for being late, right? One's car failed to start and so forth, right? So all 15 were late and they didn't make it to church on time. That church building, the Life magazine reported, exploded at 7:25 p.m. And their lateness prevented any lives from being lost, right? And so with the probability of these separate events coincidentally, being as low as about 1 in a million, one scholar argues Hume's argument might force him to reject the magazine's stuff.
Right.
Couldn't be true because it's too unusual, right? Especially if it's in a religious context, right? Clearly, that kind of stuff can't happen. Sorry, Life. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, so they were all concluding with each other to blow up the church building. They really didn't want to go to choir practice anymore.
One way to get out of it, right?
Yep, exactly.
So he says, the point is that rare events do happen, and excluding them based on probability will require the exclusion of concrete evidence supporting them. Right?
Yeah. Boy, I wonder if there's a way to classify and quantify events based on probability.
Yeah, how about the Bayes theorem or
Oh,
something?
yeah. There's that whole thing. Yeah. Well, against such objections, Hume's real argument may involve not the improbability of a particular event, but of a particular kind of event. Thus, some people reasonably counter the analogy of the lottery by pointing out that an event of this kind, someone winning, is assured, whereas events like miracles are improbable. Unfortunately, while the issue may in fact be kinds of events rather than specific events, the counter-argument against miracles presupposes what it claims to prove, right? Since miracles are improbable only on non-theistic premises, right? So, we know eventually there could be the potential of a lottery winner. So you can't talk about the improbability of one person winning, but we know that miracles never happen because God doesn't exist. But okay, we're saying God does exist, and evidence for him is miracles. And so if we're never allowed to get off the ground with making our assertion, then when you say, well, provide me evidence of a miracle, well, you're not letting me because you're immediately saying, well, we know miracles can't happen because God doesn't exist. Okay, that's the thing in question. That's what we're talking about. Moreover, whereas mere anomalies are unexpected is precisely theistic premise that allows us to anticipate the possibility of some miracles in a theistic context. Right. So the dividing of the Red Sea, let's even assume that it happened. Well, we just know that a wind really, really strong allowed for the people to cross. And then it just so happened that wind stopped at just the right time to cover the armies of the Egyptians. And it allowed the Israelites to escape. Well, OK, that's perfectly within that premise. Right. So we would say that's highly, highly unlikely to be the case. But if your non-theistic presuppositions come into play, that's your only type of ability to have an answer for why that happens. But if you're theistic, if you have the belief in God, you can have miracles occur within the context of history, of God's providence. And so which one is more likely to be the case, that a divine wind occurred, or that just it so happened that the normal course of wind events caused all these people to go across and then to cover it up when their enemies approached? Well, it would seem that you have to have more blind faith in the non-theistic approach than in the theistic approach there.
Now, this last portion here, he kind of doubles down on this theistic factor that we have just talked about. And he says analogies with lotteries are relevant only for epistemic reasons. But the real issue is that a theistic context, if not ruled out, allows for the possibility of miracles. And that's the point you were making earlier, right? Mm-hmm. And multiple well-attested miracle claims in that context makes them probable.
Right.
He gives an example of the philosopher Richard Pertil. He emphasizes unusual events might even be expected in the right context, right? In a theological, atheistic context. He says, we do not expect, for instance, athletic world records to be broken regularly, right? But we might expect them to occur at times at the Olympics. There's the context, right? And so Pertel then argues that while Jesus' resurrection makes no sense as a random event, it fits with the context of his life and teaching, which it climaxes. And so we have to look at the context, and if there's a theistic context, then that again increases the probability that the event happened, right? Just like if we're talking about somebody breaking a world record, well, in the Olympic context, that increases the probability of the event happening. And so we have to take into account the context when we're examining these various claims. So, it's not just, experience, right? Uniform experience. And it's not just, unreliable witnesses, but we also need to look at the context of the event as well when we're considering what actually happened.
Yeah, and I think that's lost sometimes in both sides trying to make their points, is that, if everything's going along, if Jesus is teaching, all of a sudden he's grabbed by the Romans and crucified on a cross and buried and resurrected, and he pops out and everyone's like, whoa, no one is expecting it, and Jesus is also surprised. That might add a little bit of more doubt into it. But if Jesus is saying, like, hey, in 3 days, if you kill me, I will raise up this temple, and if there's a historical context of entire 40 books of an Old Testament talking about all these miracles that will come to pass, and this precipice of a person who will usher in the kingdom of God. And if people are looking back to it and pointing to this being the culmination of human history, if this is surrounding it, that adds way more weight to something like the resurrection happening than just Jesus rising from the dead all of a sudden, poof, and everyone's shocked, including him, and they just go on with their life. But no, I mean, things change as a result of it, and there's even though not everyone was expecting it or believing it, the fact that people are writing about it, especially after the fact, and saying, like, here's points where everyone should have known, and here's him saying these particular things that show that he's talking about his resurrection, that just adds more to it, instead of just the someone being Usain Bolt's world record in a friendly competition at a picnic, right? So that would be even more surprising in that case. But I think
so we want to end it there and kind of pick this up. So the key takeaway here has to do with Hume's criticism of the notion of uniform experience, right, and the idea that the credibility of the witnesses. Right. And Keener has suggested that, well, you can't say uniform experience shows that miracles don't happen, because there are experiences that people claim to have of miracles. And so, so that undercuts your claim that uniform experiences shows miracles don't happen, right? So that's a serious problem there. And so you can't use that. The other issue is regard to the credibility of the witnesses. And the idea here, as Babbage points out, with regard to his calculus for credibility of witnesses, if you have independent witnesses that haven't colluded and they all are saying the same thing, that increases the probability that the event happened. And Hume doesn't seem to take that into account.
Right. But that's where we'll stop here and finish up this chapter on Hume's philosophical critiques, including some of the actual people that critiqued him next time. So we'll finish up with the chapter next time here. And so, of course, you can always go to caveofthecross.com and YouTube and Rumble and check out all the previous episodes and all the short clips there. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.